In the last video, I talked about 3 different kinds of self frames, and the golden rule is that if you're supine and they're standing, you're using at least one of them until you make connection. Because if you don't have connection and you're not using self frames, it's probably going to lead to an easy guard pass. And I also introduced the idea of what I was calling a low leg, where your near leg is trying to connect to the lead hip of your opponent to retain your guard. And probably the most iconic guard retention movement is using your far leg as a high leg. But when you start to use things like high legs, you open the door for your opponent to go side to side with their guard passing. So maybe you try a low leg and they stuff your low leg, forcing you to high leg, and now they're passing in the other direction. So in this video, we're going to talk about safer ways to go about using your legs for guard retention. And ideally, you'll be able to connect to your opponent and go into your attacks. Now, if you're interested in the tool that I use for all of my match study, it's called the Outlier Database, and it's in the description below. And over the next few months, I think it's going to develop into quite the tool for those of us that like to study film.
Do you think it's a good idea to study film?
I'm learning that now. It is a good idea, yes.
And of the 1,000 grandfather rates, there are still 238 remaining. So if you're interested, check the link down in the description and you'll be grandfathered into the $12 a month rate as a thank you for being an early adopter. Now let's get into the video. Now to start this video off, we're going to borrow some terminology from Danaher and talk about a demarcation line. And when we go to high leg, I think an important demarcation line is our opponent's head. Now let's refer to this leg as the action leg. And if this action leg crosses the line of our opponent's head, I would consider this to be an exaggerated high leg that's connecting to the lead side of our opponent's body. Now a non-exaggerated high leg is one that doesn't cross our opponent's head, and we're able to connect to the trail side of our opponent's body. Now, I think ideally we're able to use things like self-frames that allow us to not have to resort to exaggerated high legs. And we can use conservative high legs that connect to the trail side of our opponent's body. But if we're not using self-frames, we could be forced into using a high leg that's a bit more exaggerated. And the closer our high leg gets to that demarcation line, then the easier it's going to be for our opponent to switch directions and pass to the other side. So ideally, I think we're trying to connect our high leg to the trail side armpit of our opponent. And now when they try and switch sides, it's going to be much slower. And we're just going to do the same thing and use a conservative high leg to connect to the trail arm of our opponent. Now, I think a really good example of this is the weave guard pass, where if we're able to connect our high leg to the trail armpit of our opponent, the weave guard pass is going to be very difficult for them to complete. But as soon as they clear our high leg from their trail arm, it looks like the easiest pass in the world. So if we have a good starting position and they weave their arm through and threaten a pass, a great thing to practice is inverting to retain your guard. And you'll notice a lot of times off this inversion, the high leg goes from connecting at the armpit to connecting at their hip. And as you get more comfortable with this, you'll be able to go side to side and pummel your feet from hip to hip. Or you can start to combine this inversion with the low leg. And when you hear people say the next generation is going to be very hard to deal with, this is what they're talking about. Where from De La Riva, the top player does a great job of taking this weave grip and threatening the guard pass. And the bottom player begins to invert just enough to free his bottom leg to go into the low leg and retain his guard. But sometimes we're going to lose the battle at the trail arm and we're going to be forced to do an exaggerated high leg to connect to the lead side of our opponent. And from there, maybe we use a hand assist to help fight our foot back across to the hip and retain our guard. What we don't want is for them to threaten some sort of a guard pass like a knee cut and for our high leg to get caught in no man's land. where they can start to go into over-under type passes with relative ease. Or they can pop up to north-south and threaten the guard pass from there. So if we do find ourselves in this position here, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to win the battle at the trail arm. So I think we need to try to win the battle at the lead arm and get our high leg inside. But this is where things start to get a bit dicey from a guard retention perspective. Because as soon as our foot drifts past that demarcation line of their head, the only thing saving us from our partner just switching sides is going to be our non-action leg. And if they're able to beat this leg, they're probably going to pass our guard. And one interesting question to ask is, why is Gordon Ryan able to beat Victor Hugo's leg in this scenario? But then later on in the match, he's not able to beat the non-action leg and complete the pass. Now, there are many potential reasons as to why, but I think the one that's worth diving into now is also very prevalent in the world of leg lock defense. Now, the idea of countering a leg lock with a back take is something that's becoming more common at the highest level of jiu-jitsu. And the basic idea is, as the attacker is inverting to attack a heel hook, they have now taken their own back off the mat, so if we can find a way to free our leg, we're going to be able to capitalize on this back exposure. And if the attacker is not willingly inverting to expose their back, then we can use things like the berimbolo to be more proactive about creating that back exposure. But the problem is that lower back exposure is relatively easy to create, but it's very difficult to create upper back exposure. And shout out to Gordon Ryan Supine Instructional for that terminology. So when we try this berimbolo action from an unathletic position such as this, it's going to be very difficult for us to lift our opponent's upper back off the mat. So a lot of times, in order to get this to work, you're going to have to create some momentum. And you can do things like rolling through to help lift their upper back off the mat. But if you are trying to do it without rolling, one way to get more momentum would be to stand up, so you can generate more force when you're going for this type of movement. Now, there's obviously a lot of factors that play into this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that when Gordon Ryan started on his knees, he was not able to clear the hook of Victor Hugo. But when he started from the feet, his baseball slide motion had a bit more momentum behind it, and he was able to complete the guard pass. So what I'm proposing here is the idea that against a standing opponent, you should be very reluctant to put a lot of stock in this hook, because they're probably going to beat it, and when they do, they're either going to pass your guard or take your back. Now, things start to get very interesting when we connect this to K-guard. The classic K-guard entry typically looks something like this. Your hips come up and off the mat, and your action leg comes over and chops behind their knee, forcing them into backside 50-50, and they're probably going to backstep, resulting in frontside 50-50. And basically all this is a very exaggerated high leg. And our action leg is well past the demarcation line of their head. So ideally, I think we're able to bring our non-action leg to their far hip to help mitigate against that back exposure. But once you commit to that inversion from K-guard and you bring your outside leg up and over, you're putting a lot of stock in that non-action leg. And against the standing opponent, I'm starting to think it's a more and more dangerous thing to do. And that's assuming you can't even get that foot to the far side, but a lot of times it's a bit congested and it's difficult to do. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you're committed to this inversion against an opponent who's in an athletic position, and you don't have that safety net of having your foot on the far side, you're kind of playing with fire a bit, and the back exposure becomes very real. And after watching a lot of K-guard sequences on the Outlier database, I'm starting to think that the safer thing to do is just leave your back on the mat from K-guard against a standing opponent, and use different forms of attack that don't require you to take your back off the mat. And I think one great option from K-guard against a standing opponent is to pummel your action leg as a hook behind theirs, which will allow for a relatively easy transition to X-guard. And the basic battle is going to be you're trying to bring their knee on top of your chest. And as you're trying to bring their knee on top of your chest, they can stand up. And to be honest, in the past, I personally probably would have tried to invert and throw backside 50-50. But you can see Junie is not forcing the inversion and he's leaving his upper back on the mat. But DeAndre's doing a really good job of controlling his outside leg. And Junie was not able to win that battle and they reset. But Jozef Chen was able to win that battle against Isaac. You can see Jozef trying to pull the knee onto his chest, but Isaac is able to keep his posture. So Jozef says, cool, I'm just gonna bring my outside leg in as a hook. And in this way, Jozef is able to go into a very strong attack while also leaving his upper back on the mat to limit the risk of back exposure. Now, I think the next question would be, okay, when is it okay for me to invert? And in my opinion, the green light to invert is when you make them unathletic. And from K-guard, a lot of times what this means is you're pulling that knee to your chest and you're pushing them back towards their butt. And if you're able to off-balance them to their butt, now it doesn't really matter that this hook is still on the near leg because they don't have enough athleticism to take advantage of the back exposure. So now you're free to invert and go into your attacks. And at this point, you can do a few different things with the foot that's on the hip. You can try and bring it to the inside and enter into forms of cross-ashi. Or you can leave it on the outside and enter forms of 50-50. But attacks from K-guard don't have to be leg locks, and a lot of times I think it's a good idea to wrestle up. But the same rules apply. You still off-balance them backwards, which makes them unathletic, which makes the inversion less risky. But this time, instead of entering into the legs, you wrestle up. And if your non-action leg stays on this hip, when you invert, this wrestle up is going to be a great option that will get you a ton of style points. But if as you invert, you bring that foot from the near hip to the far hip, you can shoot into reverse close guard. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I know Lachlan Giles talks about it on Submeta. And it can be a great counter to something like a leg drag as well, where basically this bottom leg is our K-guard leg, and if we bring that to the other hip, we can shoot into reverse close guard. But if you're gonna do something like this, just be sure that you've changed your oil relatively recently, because someone might check. K-guard also offers a great way to chain lower body attacks with upper body attacks, and you'll often see people going from K-guard into arm bars or triangles. But again, oil checks.
I'm gonna have to get in there and push.
But the basic idea that I'm trying to get across here is that if our opponent is athletic, it seems to me like the best thing to do is to leave your own back on the mat to limit the back exposure. Here we see Gabriel Souza first off-balancing his opponent backwards before throwing his action leg all the way over. But then as his opponent starts to pressure back into him, first things first, he puts his back on the mat. And then from here, he's able to go into different pummeling options and attacks without having to worry about the risk of back exposure. And again, here we see Junie trying to knock DeAndre backwards, but he can't do it. But Junie is patient and he leaves his back on the mat to reset. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the classic K-guard entry into backside 50-50 does not work. I'm just saying that there are risks involved in it, especially if they get this cross scoop grip on your action leg. Because if they have this scoop grip and you're not able to get your foot inside their armpit, they can thread their hand through and just pass to the same side. So what this does is force you into a super exaggerated high leg to get your foot inside their armpit, to prevent the guard pass to the same side of your body. And now the only thing saving you from them switching sides is your non-action leg. And against a standing opponent, they're probably going to beat it. Here we can see Jed trying to use K-guard to get into backside 50-50 against a standing J-Rod. And I think this is exactly the situation you want to avoid as the bottom player. J-Rod's able to get that cross scoop grip on the action leg, and Jed is not able to get his foot inside the armpit. So now Jay has the ability to pass to either side. And if Jed keeps his hook extended onto that far leg, it's going to be relatively easy for Jay to thread his arm through and pass to the same side. So Jed shuts that down by bringing his knee in, making it very difficult for Jay to pass to that same side. But now that foot is not controlling the far leg, and it's the easiest thing in the world for Jay to switch sides and complete the guard pass. So knowing when it's safe to invert from K-guard is extremely important. And a lot of times if their elbow is in good position on your outside leg, it's going to be extremely risky for you to invert. And a lot of times it just makes sense to leave your back on the mat and go into something like close guard. And I think this whole video can be summed up by this clip here. Our opponent is controlling our bottom leg well, so there's no low leg. And he also has a good grip on our far leg with decent head position, making it difficult for us to use a conservative high leg and connect to the trail arm of our opponent. So we have to use an exaggerated high leg to connect to the lead side of our opponent. And when we do, we bring that foot all the way back through to the trail hip and we enter into K-guard. And from K-guard, if we pull that knee to our chest and we off balance our opponent backwards, we have the green light to invert and start to go into our attacks. And at this time in my jiu-jitsu career, this is the best way that I know of to limit the risk and maximize the reward from K-guard. And if you want access to the tool that I use for all of my match study, it's called the Outlier Database and it's in the description below. And included with that subscription will be access to the Discord where you can bounce ideas off myself as well as hundreds of other people. So I hope to get to know you in the Discord, but if not, thanks for making it this far. Leave a fist bump in the comment section and I'll see you in the next video.